Thank you, Vicky. So we are looking at inspiring women of the Bible, and we had a really good kickoff last Sunday. For those of you who are here, it's a really good talk, really engaging. And David, our guest speaker, talked about how God intervenes. We follow a God who intervenes in our lives, and he actually encouraged us to use the gifts that God has given us. And today we're looking at a woman called Rahab. I don't know if all of you know who she is, but basically Rahab is someone we find in the book of Joshua, and she's working in an inn. And in our translation, it says Rahab was a prostitute. Actually, the original Hebrew word is a bit more grey, and basically she worked in an inn which had most likely some normal rooms and some special rooms, if you know what I mean. And we don't know if she was just an innkeeper or if she actually was a prostitute or not. And we tend to be very surprised when we listen to these stories in the Bible of someone who is kind of looked down by the rest and ends up being one of the heroes of the story. And we are surprised because we come from such a different mentality than God's mentality. We come from a mentality where we think the powerful and the important and the famous are going to be the ones who are going to change the world and have an impact. And in the Bible, that's so not the case. In the Bible, Rahab, if she was a prostitute, we don't know, but if she was, she is God's people. She is God's crew. She is the one that God is walking alongside. And it's so different to how we see the world that we actually are surprised. But actually, if we look at Jesus' story, Jesus, how he walked on the earth, we shouldn't be surprised that these are the people he picks to change the world. We shouldn't be surprised at all, because these are God's people. This is God's family. This is God's crew. This is like, if you think, what's God's gang? This is God's gang, not the powerful. And actually, if you think a bit more about, say, if she was a prostitute, we don't know, like 5,000 years ago, these people weren't someone who said, oh, I really like sex, so I'm going to be a prostitute. I really like having sex with these old, filthy men. Yeah, I'm going to go and choose to be a prostitute. No, of course not. She was born into a situation where they were usually forced, sometimes to slaves, into a situation where they had to do that. They didn't have a choice. And actually, the bad guy in these stories are these other people who took benefit out of it, the oppressors, not her. She is someone who was born into a really unfortunate situation, and actually in her journey she met with God, and something lovely happened. So let's go back a bit in the story. So we're looking at Joshua. For those of you who don't know where we are standing in the Bible, it's basically the heart of the Old Testament. The heart of Israel's story is when they leave Egypt. So everything in the story of the Old Testament is either like what's happened before and what happens after. It's a bit like Jesus in the New Testament. Like the heart of it is Jesus' death and resurrection, and we hear a bit of what happens before and a bit of what happens afterwards. In the Old Testament, their story is when they leave Egypt. And Joshua is the leader after Moses, and it's a really important story in the Bible, a book in the Bible. And Rahab actually appears in the second book, in the second chapter. But before that, Joshua became a leader because when Moses had to see what the promised land was, the land they were going in, he sent some spies to go and look at it. So he sent 12 people to go around and check what's happening. And Joshua and Caleb were the two who came back and said, actually, look, it's terrible. There's no way we're going to get in there. But if God is with us, then we'll do what he promised to do. And the other 10 were like, oh, this is impossible. Let's just back off. And that's where God said, okay, this is the leader I need. And he put Joshua in charge. So Joshua's doing the same thing. He's sending some spies to check the land, to check how the land is that they're next going to. And he sends 2 spies to go into check Jericho, which was the kind of big city. And there they end up in an inn, and I don't want to kind of decide why they ended up there in an inn where there was prostitutes, and let's not doubt them, but actually they went there because that's where the travelers went. That's where all the information was. And as I said, there were good rooms and like where people behaved correctly and rooms where people didn't. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and said that they went to a good room. But when they were there, they actually, that was a place where all the visitors were coming. So that was a place where you'd gather information. So it's a really good place to be as a spy. And that's where they meet Rahab. And when they meet Rahab, she listens to their story, and she has recognized, and when they're talking, she recognizes that they're dealing with a power that's bigger than them. She said, well, actually, people here are afraid. We've heard about what God did, and the truth is, I realize that what you've got is bigger, and therefore, she changes sides. So when someone comes in and asks about, are there spies in this room with you? Are they in this inn where you are? She says, actually, no, they're not. And she helps them escape because someone was trying to get them. So at that point, Rahab has to make a choice. Either she's going to help the spies out, or she is going to give them in and maybe get some benefits from giving the spies in. And obviously we know that she decides to help them out. And that, at the end of the day, means that they are there for 3 days, then they kind of go back with intel, and then the Israelites are able to come in and conquer the land. But it's a fascinating story because actually what she does and what she does to gain God's favor is she lies. And it's a very difficult gray area, isn't it? Like, she gains God's favor by lying to spies. And I know that sort of creates a bit of tension as to, did she do the right thing? And in history, there's been so many times when people have done this, like Corrie ten Boom and Bonhoeffer, which I'll mention later. All these people who did something that, like, when we look at it, it seems wrong, but actually there is a bigger good that comes out of it. And therefore, just by choosing to help these guys, Rahab gains God's favor, and then she joins the Israelite group. And we find in James, there we go, in James 2:25, actually it says, in the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? So that's the story in a nutshell. And let's see what do we learn from it. And there's many things we learn from this story. And the first thing is that Rahab is actually the first non-Israelite to join the people of God. They've just left Egypt. There's this big group of people. And Rahab, who is seen by all of us, maybe in a judgmental way, is the first one God calls into this new group of people. And it gives us a glimpse of God's heart. It gives us a glimpse of who God is. God is the one who has a favor for the outcast and the poor and the oppressed. And therefore, we never should be surprised that he chooses to work with people that others might look down to. And the second is that God sees the world and his history in a very different way. And actually, Rahab is mentioned in Joshua 2, and then again further along the story, and then that's it. And all she did was help God's people conquer Jericho. And she did something really small, but actually, I don't know how many of you remember that there's a book in Hebrews 11, that talks about all the kind of greats in the history, like all the greats who've done amazing things in the past. And it talks about Moses and Joshua and all the big names. And there, in between all those names, we find Rahab. And let's have a look at what it says in Hebrews 11. It says, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And Hebrews continues to say, they were put to death by stoning, talking about all these people, what they went through. They were sawn in two. They were killed by a sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. The world was not worthy of someone like Rahab. I love that. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the grounds. So what I see is that in Rahab's story, and this is what I find fascinating, is that there was kind of a narrative, a story over her life, where she was born into a situation where she ended up having to be a prostitute, having to do something that obviously she was not very happy with. And she starts hearing about a God who's doing some amazing things far away, a God who's doing all these great things back there. And she starts hearing the stories. And we don't know really what's happened to her because obviously we just get like 20 verses to talk about it. But she's hearing these stories. And then she gets this opportunity where she can connect with that God. That she gets this moment in her life where her story, the story of her life, can change. And she can change that narrative. Where the narrative was, you were born into a prostitute family, you end up being a prostitute, your children will be prostitutes. Like this narrative that was her story, that someone had put on her, and she suddenly finds this moment where she can change that story, where that narrative can change, because she's hearing the narrative of a different God who does things differently. And when she gets that opportunity, she seizes it. She's got that opportunity to change the narrative, the story of her life. And she grabs hold of that opportunity, and her story changes. And then she's joined into this new people with this new God, and her family comes with her, and they start a new story. And her children are then Israelites, part of this new narrative. So the narrative she was brought into, she didn't choose it. She definitely didn't choose. Nobody chooses to be a prostitute, I can assure you that. She's got this narrative, and she finds the opportunity to change a narrative. And then the story changes. And the unfolding story of her life changes to something completely different. And that's the beauty of Rahab's story. She has this story upon her, and she chooses to change it. She's able to change the story of her life. And I'm going to share a little video now it's basically a movie based on a movie I watched like a few days ago. I do that a lot. I watch a movie and suddenly it clicks on something that is connected with what I'm going to share, and I use it. And the movie is called One Chance, and the main actor is James Corden, who I love. We love James Corden, don't we? I love him. He's actually the son of a Bible distributor, which is a kind of different story. He tells a story of this guy who works in Wales. He just has a normal job, a very normal person like everyone else. But since he's born, he's got this massive passion. And let's have a look at what happened to him when he ended up in a television program called Britain's Got Talent, first season.
Paul, what are you here for today, Paul?
To sing opera. I've always wanted to sing as a career. Confidence has always been sort of like a difficult thing for me. I've always found it a little bit difficult to be completely confident in myself.
Okay, ready when you are. So you work at Car Phone Warehouse, and you did that. I wasn't expecting that.
No, neither was I.
This was a complete breath of fresh air. I thought you were absolutely fantastic.
You have an incredible voice. I think if you keep singing like that, you are going to be one of the favourites to win this whole competition.
I think that we've got a case of a little lump of coal here that is going to turn into a diamond.
So Paul Potts, he ended up winning Britain's Got Talent, sang in front of the Queen, sold something like 2 million CDs, and still lives in the same town in Wales with his same wife. Love him. And I love that he changed the narrative of his life. He sees the opportunity to change, to do something different, to see life differently. And I think there's a call from looking at Rahab's story to say, there's a story unfolding in my life, and is there something I want to do differently? Is there something I want to change in the narrative of my life, of my church, of my front line, of my community, of my country, world? Is there something in that narrative that we want to go against and seize the opportunity to change and to see differently? And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a really smart guy, and he says, we need feel no shame as Christians about a measure of impatience, longing, protest against what is unnatural, and a strong measure of desire for freedom and earthly happiness and the capacity to effect change. And what Bonhoeffer is saying is, there's a God story that's different, that isn't what we see around us. And it's all right to be impatient and frustrated with how things are going, because that means we're going to try and effect change and bring God's narrative everywhere we come. Join in with what God is doing, join in with the song God is singing, and join in with his story. And that's what Rahab did. And I don't know if we are going to change the world, and I don't know if anyone will ever be as inspired as this guy to be so famous, and I don't really care. But what I do know is that God invites us to join in his narrative, in this story that he is unfolding, and invites us to be part of it, and invites us to be a bit uncomfortable with how things are going, uncomfortable enough to try and look for change, to pray for change, to be that change, to bring his spirit and his work to those around us. So I'm going to invite us just to have a minute in silence. And I'd like us to think about what in your life, in your church, in your community, in the world, what is it in that narrative, in that story that you see unfolding, and yet you feel or expect it to continue unfolding, that you think, well, I want this to change. I want this to be different. I want to seize the opportunity to join into the narrative of the God who acts miracles, who does things amongst us, and say, I want to join in that and see something different. So think about something either in your life, in your church, community, world, which you'd like to see that narrative change, that story change. And let's bring it to God. So let's spend 1 or 2 minutes in silence thinking about this.